My name's Joshua Yeldham. I'm from Sydney, Australia. As a young boy, at an early age, I hid inside my drawings a lot, and I was often clinging to my mum's leg, and I didn't have great self-esteem, and I was surrounded by very talented sisters, and I didn't quite know, I didn't have anything happening for me that allowed me to feel I was doing well, and my drawings played a large role in kind of calming me at a time when I wanted to be great at something and I didn't know what, and I just wanted to be great. And I went on a very long journey to try and learn to be wonderful at something within my own mind, not what people were saying necessarily. I mean, obviously, Mum's comments are important, but just I wanted to do something great. I was very dyslexic, and at that point, that wasn't really discovered, and so I was failing everything at school. I was at a school where I was picked on a lot, and a blessing came to me, which was that my mother took me to Europe, and I left Australia. And in living in Europe, I discovered mountains, and I discovered climbing mountains, and I became so driven to climb mountains that I would sneak out of my school at night, which was in Switzerland, and I would climb at night. And I would fight through a process of fear of darkness and fear of wind and the noise of the skis with skins on them crunching against the ice to get to the little top of this mountain in my school so I could watch sunrise and then ski all the way back down to school before anyone would notice I had snuck out. Why? Why was I doing this? Partly because as a young boy in an urban environment, I saw pictures of Chinese landscapes where people were praying near waterfalls, and where people were practicing forms of martial arts or poetry, and there was this romantic kind of concept of this other world, this other place where if you pursued something in your mind long enough, you would reach this level, this mysterious level, which I didn't know quite what it was, but it seemed very attractive to me. And in climbing mountains, I started to push through layers of failure, wanting to give up the expedition and curl in a ball because of exhaustion, and yet my teammates would say, you can't, you've got to keep going. And so in pushing through boundaries and hardships and being cold and wet, we would end up on a little summit of a mountain above the clouds in this place that started to allow me to feel was that place of peace, prayer, of nothingness. This was at the age of 14 I was doing this, and I did it in Europe until I was 19, and must have climbed some 60 mountains. I left for university in America, where I studied filmmaking, and I wanted to be a documentary filmmaker because my last year in Europe I started filming for some men who were climbing Everest, and I was making promotional film for them. Which happened by accident because the cameraman was sick one day and they just gave me the camera. And once I got a taste of that, I went to film school and enrolled and found it really dull and boring, and bought a ticket to South America on my first holiday. And as I was landing in Venezuela in Merida, I saw this perfect pyramid summit where only like 2 people can land on it out the window, and I just knew somehow I had to climb that mountain. So when I landed in the valley, I went straight to the market, bought some food, and went to the base of this mountain. I started climbing it, and 2 days later, up through the rainforest, I had a map that I worked out with the park ranger, and after 2 days, fog came in, and the fog blinded me from going any further up or down, and I couldn't work out where I was. And I waited in a rocky overhang, and on the second day I started to think that I had made quite a bad decision, and I started to write a letter to Mum, and I was getting a bit panicky, and out of the kind of grasses or you know, the greenery, came this man with a big beard yelling at me, fuera, fuera, which is kind of basically piss off, piss off. And he was yelling at me, and he had like furs on, and he eventually sat down, and we made a fire, and he started asking, you know, telling me, pointing to all my gear, saying I was so unprepared, I could work that out. I told him I wanted to go up. He started pointing to my shoes, which were really nice mountaineering shoes. So I worked out he wants my shoes and he'll take me up. So I gave him my shoes, and then I had little leather dinner shoes. So I wore my leather dinner shoes, and for 2 weeks we climbed this mountain together. He showed me this white horse, which is symbolic to him because he lives in a cave up there. He's a hermit of some description, and then he makes jewelry out of coconuts, and then he comes down to the valley and sells them, and then goes back up into the mountain. We went on this journey together. It blew me away to the point when I came back to film school and my teachers were asking me to make these little movies. I said, I've had a life experience and I'd like to make a bigger movie, and they said no. And I tried to fit back into school, but I just had this calling that something massive had happened in my life and I should pursue it. So I flew back to Australia and told Mum that I needed to create dinner parties and functions to raise money to make a movie, and to go back to Venezuela and ask this man if I could make a movie about us. 2 years of fundraising and 60 sponsors and 12 mates who were all willing to fly themselves to the base of this mountain. I would pay for food and donkeys to take the food up to a 6,000-metre plateau where we would film most of the movie. I was sponsored with tents and film equipment, but nothing from my school. They refused because they said we don't give equipment out to overseas concepts, projects, and besides you're a freshman and you can only make a larger movie, like 15 minutes when you're a senior. To cut a long story short, it took 7 years to make this movie. It took everything out of me. I learned the first taste of being so driven that I lost some friends along the way. I thought for periods of time the film would never finish, it would never be made. I showed it to certain people and they thought it wasn't that great. Finally, a couple of people came on board on the 7th year. A well-known film critic in Australia got behind it. My cameraman, without me knowing it, entered it in the Emmy Awards in the United States, and we won for Best Student Film in the United States, which launched my career, and then we got nominated for an Oscar for Best Student Film in the United States, which we came second. Thank you. And then to speed things up, I was instantly catapulted. The Australian government pulled me in and said, we'll give you money to make another movie, what do you want to do? I said, well, I wanted to learn about my land. I've lived away from Australia for such a long time. And what happened was the Queen gave me some money through a trust, and I bought a combi van, and I went out to the desert. And halfway in Australia, I went into a national park, and I was on a dirt road, and I hadn't told the ranger I was going to this national park, and there was a huge water hole in the middle of the track, and I thought, oh, I'll just drive up the creek bed in my combi, which was really hard sand, and I'll divert the water hole. So I'm cruising up for about half a day to get around this bend in the road, and my combi sunk in the sand in the river, and then I realized, oh, I'm doing this again. I'm out of my bounds and I'm lost. And I kind of waited. I had a UHF radio and no one was, I was trying to get help and no one was answering. So I carried my fuel. I had 3 jerry cannons in the combi. I carried one with tape saying help with an arrow, and I carried it back to where the track was, where the water hole was, and I put an arrow up the creek bed. And I walked back to the combi, so that took about 2 hours to walk back to the combi. And I waited, because you always wait in your car when you're lost. 2 days later, waiting with my cans of tuna, a man arrived and again yelled at me and told me I was an idiot and that he would take me to where he lives. It turned out he was a boundary rider and he lives on the dingo fence, which is the longest fence in the world. It's a fence that we use to keep dingoes out of New South Wales territory to stop the wild dogs from eating sheep and cattle. And this man's job is that he has to go up and down his section of fence, repairing it all the time. He lives in isolation, helicopters drop food to him, and he's an ex-Vietnam vet. And I lived with him, and together, again, I started to learn a new world that this man was creating. And I learned what he was also running away from. I wrote a movie over 2 years about a character that was based on him. I wrote a movie about this man who was to keep the dingoes out, who actually had fallen for the dingoes with great respect for them, how they marry for life, how they're so resilient. And his problem was that in a storm, this is in the movie, in a storm, the fence was blown over. The dingo couple that he had spent so much time with was separated because one of them went over the fence, and then other boundary riders in the storm had erected the fence back up, and these dingoes were separated. And over days and days and days, he slowly ate at my main character. And so he started to build a catapult and teach the male dingo to step in this wooden box, and by stepping in it, it would hit a lever and fly him over the fence, and that way he wouldn't lose his job by allowing, by technically pulling the fence down. And during this, a nurse is sent to visit him because the locals believe he's gone insane, and the nurse's job is to, confirm that, and he will be removed. And so it's just about, the film was about 3 days that this nurse spent with this man in this world. And when I went back to the government and presented the script, my assessor had changed, and I had a new assessor, and she just looked at me straight in the eyes and said, "We're not going to make this movie." And I crumbled, and I went home, and I absolutely felt that I couldn't keep going. I felt I was exhausted, I felt I wasn't nurtured, and I felt sorry for myself. And I had a palm husk that a builder had left a belt sander, a very thin one, and when I was about 16 I carved a palm in Aboriginal kind of African style, because I always thought primitive art was fascinating. And I had spent, when I was in Europe, I had visited so many primitive cultures in Africa, in Morocco, in Algeria, that I only ever knew about kind of primitive line making. Even though in Europe I had visited all the greats, I was always drawn to primitive, mostly African sculpture. When I saw this palm husk, I just looked for that tool, and I kept looking for it in my boxes, and I found it again, and I started to draw and carve. And I went back out to the desert, and I took 100 sheets of paper, and I spent 40 days alone in a sand dune, and I made something every day. And then I brought them back, and my sister and my mother had just opened a gallery, and they said, "An artist has just cancelled a show, why don't we put them on the wall and see what happens?" And that was the beginning of my painting career about 14 years ago. My work is still driven by spiritual hunger to polish myself and be as bright as I can. This is something that I've always admired in the greatest of holy men and women that I've met in my life, is how do we polish ourselves? If we were a mirror with dust on it, how do we polish ourselves so that we can reflect light? Light is holy light, compassion, understanding, wisdom. And so a lot of these works are my attempt to manage anxiety, manage fear, and to release myself to a larger power. The owls played a large role in, again, a narrative of where I needed help, I needed guidance, because I was told that I was infertile, I was told that I had a gene called 508, which is the cystic fibrosis gene, which little boys who have that are unable to deliver sperm, but they make sperm that they're unable to deliver it. And all this news came so quickly when my wife and I were trying to have a child. Prior to finding this out, all the doctors were saying it was my wife's problem and that she was stressed and all these things. So eventually we realized it was me, which, you know, was a big hit. And so I went into the bush and I, again, spent some time alone to deal with this concept that I may not have children. And there was an owl in the tree, and I felt like that owl was taking my fertility from me, and I was using the owl as a focus for something that can take life or give life, and using old knowledge of just natural, the natural world of life and death. And so I started to make offerings to the owls to hope to have a child. And then the doctor said, no, maybe we can work with you, and we can maybe take your sperm and work with Joe's eggs and create an embryo. And straight away my daughter was born, Indigo. And the owls became even more important to me, and my landscapes became more important in the pursuit of thanks, and also to the hope that we may have one more child. 4 years it took for my son to be conceived, and we lost more embryos. And again, I was working with owls, I was making musical instruments to lure the owls, and I was painting landscapes to try and lock me into the earth, to just try and stabilize me in a time when I was working with science, which is very alienating at times, and medicine, and trying to lock into the earth and learn that in chaos and death can come new life. In chaos and death can come new life. In Bali, my wife and I had spent quite a bit of time prior to this period where we learned prayers, and we learned offerings, and we learned water purification ceremonies with a priest that we spent quite a bit of time with. And so those prayers started coming to me even more strongly. The prayer for hope, the prayer for protection, the prayer for guidance, and the prayer for forgiveness. Just those simple, universal prayers that can open one up to many things. With the arrival of Jude, the work became celebrational, and this show is the celebration series. This is the leaving of my requirement for more fertility, but to acknowledge the land where I come from, the Hawkesbury River, Pittwater, and to acknowledge the owls. And then Mandy and Kate, who worked here, gave me this wonderful idea of possibly going to another great river, which was the Yulong River. And when I did my research, I knew straight away that they were onto something, because I saw that this is a very fertile place, a place of great respect for landscape painting. Over the last hundreds of years, Chinese artists have painted the landscape, and it connected to my childhood, going back where I used to see these landscapes where people were within this incredible the scale of land and rock and cliff to human, and yet the human seem interwoven as if part of the fabric. And so my wife and I had our first break in 7 years with the kids to go and have a little honeymoon, and then I took my paints and I had a raft that I used at about 4 or 5 in the morning when all the fishermen were out, and I painted on the end of the raft, and then I had a bicycle with Joe, and we rode into the field. And one farm in particular had these incredible rocks, and most of these paintings were done with these ladies that work in the farm. They allowed me to kind of camp there and sleep under the tree and work. And so you'll see in the end room the work that I did in that farm in particular, and from a little room that Joe and I rented, room 508, which I didn't make the connection until Fiona here said, "Do you realise that's the 508 room?" I carve, I sand, I wear, I rode, just as all my landscape in Australia is worn by the sun and the wind. Everything's carved with that belt sander that I found in my box. I've subsequently bought more because I burned them out, but I even carve the paper now with the belt sander. It gives me this energy line that gives me vibration and connects me to power. I find great power and reverence in carving, just as many cultures carve. I work with the vibrational space between lines, which is again a universal knowledge of repetition. In repetition comes abandonment of mind, and comes new fruits. I never plan a painting, they guide me places. I start with a lyrical line and they become places. So no work is pre-thought. Each work is grown. In this case, yes, I did preconceive eyes, but had no idea of body and mind. And so for me, every work is a struggle of release and letting go and letting them take me places. That's why each work has its own nucleus, its own energy, and yet they're connected by a common thread. In this case, I'm in my little tinny, and I use the tinny to go and get supplies at a little town further upriver, but when I come back to my main boat, which is the studio, I pass this rock, this one rock that always is a snakehead to me. And it always tells me, you know, be alert, be aware. It's such a powerful rock, and yet it's surrounded by all this beauty and bliss and gum trees, the repetition of gum trees. And I finally made this painting in the tinny with this piece of paper. My tinny's as long as this paper. And balancing and just trying to work with calligraphy, I find it partly humorous that my body's having to work in a, you know, in water, and yet the pursuit is to fly above like a bird and have stillness. So again, just starting with the snake head and then starting to just lose my mind and drift up into landscape. Carving comes later, and again getting back to the energy lines, a lot of the stick work that you'll see in this show happened in a way that was an evolution, but not a lot of thought. And then over time I started to understand what was happening, which was all the geometry of the oyster leases in my river, which are man-made against the natural landscape, were such a strong character in my journeying. But the biggest realization was my wife for 7 years has had all her notes in front of her because she's been studying Chinese medicine and acupuncture with all the meridian lines. And then as she starts to practice on me, because I'm her pincushion, or on other friends, that search for energy and then tapping in, I started to tap in with my stick work and search for, we'll go and look at one, search for energy lines within the work, and then I start caning them. And when I cane them, I put little white tips on them to energize them, and then I love the way the natural light changes their shadows as if it's like a natural sundial, a natural, because I don't use time in the bush, so you're working with shadow and light to know where you're at in the day. The same with these sticks. When I carve with my belt sander, it's the same. I then go into the landscape and say, where is the energy here? And I start pulling it out, and as I carve, I start bringing this new dimension, which is the dimension of energy. I'll show you one other work. This is a musical work. Downstairs is a major owl musical work, which is getting famed. As you walk, you play music. So when I'm alone in the bush, that has a power to it, because A, it helps you feel you're not alone and vulnerable. It helps connect you to land. It helps connect you to the people you love. So I know that there are certain people back at home that respond to that noise when they hear me, especially my children. They know I'm coming home if they hear that through coming down the stairs, through the window. The power of music is intoxicating, and I'm not a great musician, but I love rhythm. And all these works are completed by the concept of releasing the ego who wants result and reward straight away, and just sticking to rhythm of making something. And that allows you to last the duration, to bring something to its fullness. In this case, you know, this is based on simple rhythms that are designed to, in this case, lure the owls down into my waterhole to bring me prosperity or bring me hope or vision. I try and convert the instrument into landscape. That's what interests me. I've always wanted to marry sculpture with two-dimensional design. It's been really difficult for many years, and finally I feel I'm starting to find a grasp of of integrating a third dimension with a flat plane. These are all the tuners which all tune the instrument to the new owner's desire, and I said to the person who bought this, I hope that you come home, whether you're in a melancholy mood or happy, and you just tune it and just strum, and that this is your instrument, this is for you to call or bring peace or release anger, or and I think that again this goes back to fetishes and goes back to kind of animism of you making something that you're charging to bring you power or calmness. So that's, and downstairs is the owl one that you'll see as you leave. I also am very interested in carving photography. Again, I'm shooting a photograph of a tree that my children all grew up lying in. So it's very dusty. Wow. How's that? This is a tree that each of my kids, when they were born, slept here in this beautiful, almost a woman's belly for me. And trees are often female for me. They're often so seductive and sensual. This is a mangrove tree. I parked my little tinny here, and I come over here and I took the photo. And then when I got back to the studio, I wanted to carve I wanted to bring my line work into this tree, and I wanted to adorn her as I would adorn with tattoo, or I wanted to bring sensuality into the line and fertilities, and I wanted to caress this tree. So this is a new departure in the last year or so of carving photography. The paper is exciting to me. It's incredibly difficult to make. It's cotton, it weighs a ton. It's actually more like cotton cardboard. But when I carve it, which there's a documentary playing, cotton goes everywhere. It's like snow, but it's magical because I can create this whole new dimension with, again, energy and lines. I'm working with indigo color. I feel like I'm still a student of color, and I'm narrowing my palette very tightly. And I find that I often just go in the bush with just indigo at this point in time. Partly because the river system is two colours. Brown is the upper Hawkesbury and the blues is the Pittwater. They have different personalities. And within the trees are again the line work and the lacing and just my dreaming that occurs in the carving. I don't fully know there's not a full explanation of it. It's just my way of capturing growth and the spiraling of nature and the curvature of nature. Within every picture are mysterious elements that I don't often know about until later. Sometimes I reinterpret, I see my owl eye occurring, but that was not intentional until almost the last kind of attempt to tie in the line work. I see things like stingrays. I didn't know that at the time. So one of my joys of making a painting is to have a painting that keeps revealing new things about it. And that way, after 11 years of having a work, you're constantly re-exploring your landscape or your narrative. I'm not very good with pictures that tell you who they are straight away. I like things to reveal themselves. Hence, the work is complex. I'm still in the complex part of my life. I'm a young father, everything's moving very quickly, and yet when I go out into the land, suddenly it drops into complete stillness. But generally my life is quite complex, and in time the paring back of imagery will occur. But right now I'm trying so many different things to learn about my alphabet, and I'm just at a curvature now where I'm starting to release, and they're starting to, I don't have to try so hard, but it's coming more and more naturally. So, you know, it's an interesting time. Let's go to the last room. I made one large work of my trip to Yangzhou and the Yulong River. On my raft, really early in the morning, I was just dangling my leg in the reeds, all these beautiful reeds that are just swaying, and then I looked up and there was this magnificent bridge, made of stone, a very small little bridge, again almost out of my fantasies when I was a boy looking at these drawings of bridges and little caves and temples. And I was blown away. I was told it was 600 years old, rigid fully, and
older than that. But how did they create this incredible arch that just marries into the landscape? How did they curve that over the river that has this energy flowing through? And then I started, started thinking about the keystone, the center stone that holds these two curves up. And I started thinking about what is the keystone in my life? Who are the people that prop me up? What are the elements of my personality that keep me stable when everything else is about to fall into the river? So this painting is the first time I've ever painted architecture within a landscape. In such a formal way, but yet I wanted the bridge to disappear, almost be not there, but it is. And I wanted to portray the mountains and the trees in quite a light, abstract way. But at the same time, I loved how fertile the land was and that people were growing all their food. And it made me realize that when I get home, I really want my children to have a taste of growing food and how vital it is that we connect ourselves back to an ancient system of working with plants. A connected story to that is a lady that I met in the Simpson Desert who played a big role in my knowledge of the desert. One day she said, let's make wattle seed ice cream. And I said, okay. And then she went out and picked wattle seeds. And she said, do you see these husks on the wattle seeds? I said, yes. And she said, we'll take the husks off and we'll put the seeds in the ice cream. And I couldn't get the husks off. And she said, watch this. And we went over to a tree and she got the wattle seeds and she laid them in a little pile, a little mound. And she said, let's go. And I went, okay. And we left. And then we were busy at her home and the day went. And next morning she said, let's go and get our wattle seeds. And we went back to the tree. And there were all the seeds with no husks on them. And I went. And then I saw one ant carrying a seed out of a hole and leaving it on the pile because they wanted the husks down in the nest. And I thought, and that always stayed with me, how do you learn to work with as against demolish and overrun and overexplore? So she, through her own process, had worked with nature. And on my trip on the Yulong, everyone was growing food, and on an economic level it makes so much sense. Why would you buy food when you can grow it? It makes no sense whatsoever. And if you can't grow something, you trade with your neighbour, which creates a social connection to people. And it reminded me of Fidel Castro during the oil crisis, that when they couldn't get food coming in or oil, he told everyone in Havana, grow food on your roof. You must all grow food on your roof, which they have done, and they have done so successfully that there are markets down in the street of everyone's produce. And I was thinking, how extraordinary is that culturally bringing the community together to trade food, being self-sufficient, not having to use capital. And at the same time, I thought of my dad, who's going in his 70s, and I thought I could just visualize him going up to his roof to check his tomatoes, and yet my dad had no idea how to grow anything or even change a light bulb. But I was visualizing how extraordinary that would be if he had another purpose to grow, because that brings back the child